New tonight, reaction coming in as MS-13 gang members are accused of killing a 15-year-old boy in Maryland. The teen last seen back in February, and Fox 5 obtaining court documents indicating the child was found dismembered.
Police on Long Island arrest a suspected MS-13 gang member. 19-year-old Jose Lopez is charged with murder. Police say he took part in the brutal killing of Josue Lenor, who was reported missing in September of 2016 and whose body was found in the Roosevelt Preserve in May. Another suspected MS-13 gang member are also being sought.
Good evening, and tonight we take you inside one of the most dangerous countries on earth, a place where criminal gangs control entire neighborhoods. And these gangs from El Salvador are now operating in nearly every corner of America. Families on both sides of the border caught in a toxic cycle of violence.
Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, an El Salvadorian gang became one of the most feared criminal groups in Central America, as well as regions of the United States. Oftentimes, members of the gang weren't hard to spot. Many literally wore their affiliations on their skin in a form of massive tattoos. Though their membership is still thought to number in the thousands, the gang is now the target of one of the largest law enforcement crackdowns in Central American history, and one that could have significant implications for countries across the region. But the story of the rise and slow dramatic fall of MS-13 isn't just about gangs and crimes. It's about the limits governments can go to stop them, even if it means innocent people get caught in the crossfires of justice. In the early and mid-1980s, several pieces of legislation resulted in then record-breaking immigration numbers, with people from countries around the world, particularly Latin America, coming to the United States. Because of its proximity to the border, and because of its status as one of the biggest cities, many of them ended up settling in LA.
The first wave of immigration comes in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and that's from El Salvador and different parts of Central America to Los Angeles in particular. And in Los Angeles, they lived in some of the most dense areas where they were in, I guess, sort of competition, if you will, with other ethnicities and nationalities, in particular the Mexican, and sort of Mexican origin gangs, let's say, that were already operational in those spaces.
That's Stephen Dudley. He is the co-founder and co-director of Insight Crime and a senior research fellow at American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies in Washington. He's also the author of the book MS-13, The Making of America's Most Notorious Gang. As he explains, at the time, the El Salvadorian immigrants who would become the gang's original members became entrenched in LA's underground music scene, while also being introduced to elements of the Mexican criminal underworld.
In LA, in those dense areas, during this time period, lots of tumult, lots of competition, and they emerge in that atmosphere. At first, as kind of a group that was very fascinated with, as many of these groups are, with music. You know, a lot of them start around sort of sports organizations or those sort of collective interests. In their case, it was music, and it wasn't just any music, it was heavy metal music. Yes. So they were very interested in heavy metal music. And one of the first cliques, they called themselves the Stoners, and, these sorts of things. They had long hair, they bobbed it up and down, all that sort of things. That was, they looked for those means by which they could connect with one another. One would be of, your origin, your country of origin, your language, of course. And then there's other interests aside from that. And it was music. But over time, due to a lot of this sort of living in this competitive environment, they evolved. They evolved into this hyper-violent, quasi-social, quasi-criminal organization that, becomes a sort of major force, especially in these very dense areas in Los Angeles, and begins to compete for space, criminal economies, and other things that are happening inside of Los Angeles. They start to be arrested in large numbers, incarcerated, then connected to some of the other sort of larger big structures bigger criminal structures that exist in the area, most notably the Mexican mafia and their collective of gangs they call the Sureños, which are all the sort of Southern California gangs. So they become part of this larger network inside the prison system.
On the streets of 1980s LA and within the prisons of Southern California, the members of MS-13 became part of a burgeoning and extremely violent gang culture that was sweeping the neighborhoods across the city. It was a high-profile problem that gripped the American public at large when newly elected President Bill Clinton took office in 1993. Addressing this problem was a way for him to try and demonstrate to the American people a tough-on-crime approach he wanted his administration to be known for. One of his first targets was members of the MS-13 gang, many of whom had spent a better part of the last decade behind bars.
All Americans, not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country, are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws we have seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it.
And then when they're let out, and it sort of coincides with the Clinton administration's push to change a lot of the laws, they're deported in mass, in huge numbers, in the thousands. They're pushed back to their countries of origin, Central America. And lo and behold, they find very fertile terrain in which they can export their gang activities and their name, their brand name.
As Steve Dudley explains, the mass deportation of gang members who became hardened in the California prison system while serving time alongside Mexican mafias had major unintended consequences.
So you find, in particular, MS-13 and 18th Street being exported in mass to Central America and reforming there, reconstituting themselves there in an image that is a facsimile of what they'd been doing in the United States, but even more violent. They found an even more sort of, open terrain for them to operate with, tremendous impunity over many, many years. And they formed and they create these structures that have, almost, challenging the state in many instances in places like El Salvador, which is a very small country about the size of Massachusetts. So it's not like it doesn't have to, they don't have to occupy a huge amount of space in order to have a huge amount of impact. And that was what was happening in places like Central America over many, many years.
Away from the crowded streets of LA, where other violent gangs and criminal groups fought tooth and nail for territory and influence, they were unleashed almost overnight into a small, under-resourced country of El Salvador, where their power could go unchecked. Over the course of several years, they went from a scrappy street gang obsessed with heavy metal onto an almost unstoppable organized crime institution that sparked an economic and security crisis in El Salvador, eventually leading to such high degree of instability that the people were forced to flee the country. Along with a variety of street crimes, they also extorted businesses and made day-to-day life dangerous throughout the region. The same violence that had made them a feared name in Southern California had been exported to communities in Central America, despite its efforts to rein them in. In fact, in some cases, the crackdown efforts actually made the gang more powerful as they consolidated their efforts from behind bars.
Officials are warning of a widespread cybersecurity attack.
Frustrations and delays have continued as countless are still without power.
Market volatility is at its highest since the pandemic.
There are a number of reports across the state.
Unidentified cracking news. There is no doubt our grid is at risk. As it joins airspace.
they start out sort of slowly usurping the power of local gangs, because there were a large number of local gangs already operational in those areas. So that was a process. Then they start to get incarcerated in mass in similar ways that they were incarcerated in mass in places like California. And then inside prison, they're the lowest in the totem pole. So they're abused, they're raped, they're pushed aside, So then there was a process whereby they start to gain power inside the prisons. And then that's really where they begin to sort of launch their power is from prisons, because, in the early 2000s, the Salvadoran government, and the other governments in the region as well, Guatemala and Honduras, launched their first efforts at, what they call sort of an iron fist policy, the mano dura, iron fist policies, in which they are incarcerating increasingly high numbers of suspected members of gangs. And, they used very kind of flimsy evidence to haul huge numbers of them into the prison system. And it's from the prison system where they begin to kind of reorganize and reconstitute themselves, sort of establish this very clear hierarchy. The prisons are the place where the sort of board of directors, if you will, of the MS-13 in El Salvador operates from. And they start to create this sort of systematic way in which they extort the bus system in El Salvador. So they start to get a regular revenue stream. They start to take over spaces where drug peddling is going on. So while they are not the ones that are peddling the drugs, they're collecting the money from the people who are peddling the drugs, which goes by, different names depending upon where you are, traqueteros or tracatos or tracks or whatever, you hear different names. But the bottom line is that they're collecting money from that operation as well. They get involved in contraband, and they start to evolve as criminal organizations do. As they extort more and more, for example, buses, then like you've seen, in many a television show, it comes to the point where the owner doesn't have any more money. So then the people who are extorting them says, well, then give me, a percentage of the ownership in the bus cooperative or whatever company it is they're extorting. So you see that starting to happen as well. And so they start to have more economic power, and then subsequently also more political power. They're able to sort of, a lot of times through their use of violence, kind of get the governments to, negotiate or at least engage with them, and give them certain concessions inside of the prison system. So you see them kind of evolve and just become a more and more powerful force in these countries, in particular in El Salvador.
But unlike criminal organizations that relied on the drug trade to generate revenue, MS-13 preyed on innocent members of the public just trying to make a living and to live peacefully in their communities. In 2015, things reached a boiling point, and El Salvador became the most violent country in the Western Hemisphere.
Very predatory criminal economy that they have set up. Most of their revenues, for many, many years came from extortion. And extortion is incredibly disruptive of many, many, many people's lives. And they're extorting to the most base level. I mean, it's the person selling tortillas at the end of the road. It's the one fixing, the sort of shoe cobbler, the local mechanic, all the way to people who they see, might be doing some work on their house. So perhaps somebody who's already migrated to the United States is sending back what's called remittances. And then somebody there who's receiving the remittances, is deciding they're going to build a back patio, or maybe they get a new car. Any indicator like that can be a kind of flashing light for the gangs to then target those people. So all the way down to the base level. They're extorting people. And this, obviously is incredibly disruptive from an economic perspective, from a physical integrity perspective, and they begin to create at the same time these kind of invisible borders is what they refer to them as. It's a really, perhaps even a bad name for it, because they're not invisible. They're very visible to the people who live in these spaces, but the people, cannot cross these borders because they're two different gang areas. You can't visit your relatives. Sometimes your kids can't go to school. Some taxi drivers might not be able to go over one side or the other. Because of the competition for these predatory criminal economies between the gangs, they start to create rivalries amongst one another, so strong that they create these kind of borders. And that also hugely impacts people's lives. And to say nothing of the sort of rampant abuse of and targeting of women and minors and others. Women, perhaps in the case of the MS-13, who doesn't allow women in their ranks anymore, sort of targeting them, to either work with them or be their girlfriends or worse, and then, many minors, in terms of trying to bring them into the fold and make them part of the gang.
Though there were slow declines in crime after its peak in 2015, thanks to negotiations between rival gangs and even some government officials, El Salvador remained plagued by widespread criminal activity. The cycle of violence and mass exodus from the country came to a head in 2019, when a young politician named Nayib Bukele began his campaign to become El Salvador's next president. Bukele entered politics young, and by the time he activated his presidential campaign, he was still in his late 30s. Having grown up in El Salvador, he witnessed the violent impacts MS-13 had on his country. Bukele had a bold platform. He vowed to end gang violence in the country.
Security was tight around many polling stations in El Salvador as residents turned out in droves to vote in the country's presidential elections. A vote many hoped would bring about change in the Central American nation, which has one of the highest murder rates in the world.
We're getting out and voting. Let's see if people come out to vote, so our vote can count. And we can say, we decided, not they decided for us.
Preliminary results gave a commanding lead to 37-year-old Nayib Bukele, a businessman and the former mayor of San Salvador. A prolific social media user who appeals to young voters, Bukele capitalized on disenchantment with the country's two main parties, which have been in power for nearly 3 decades. A former member of the ruling left-wing FMLN himself, Bukele was expelled in 2017 for criticizing its leadership and is now running for Ghana, a conservative right-wing party.
The messaging worked, and in the summer of 2019, he became the youngest president in El Salvador's history at just 37 years old. And soon, he would set out to make good on his promise. Here's Insight Crime's Alex Papadavasilakis explaining what happened next.
So I think on a very basic level, what you can say about this guy, President Nayib Bukele, is that he has taken existing hardline security measures, which in Central America are known as mano dura, or iron fist, and he's taken them to extreme new heights. So previous governments had tried to fight fire with fire with the gangs, going to the communities, getting involved in shootouts, but they never really succeeded in making a dent in their territorial control. By contrast, with this latest president, he has enacted what is called a state of emergency. So basically, he has used political power to enact extreme legal measures, which basically removed restrictions on making arrests. So the state of emergency has suspended basic civil liberties, including the right to legal defense, due process, and that has basically given the state authorities the right to arrest whoever they want, whenever they want.
In 2022, President Bukele declared a state of emergency. The designation allowed his government to suspend barriers to making mass arrests, including due process. Though they proved effective in sweeping up gang members, critics say that many innocent people were caught up in the operations as well, and have been given no ability to prove their innocence.
Outside the police station, worried mothers wait for news of their sons. Thousands of mostly young men have been arrested over the last few weeks as El Salvador tries to clamp down on gang violence. New emergency powers means the police can hold suspects for 15 days without evidence or access to lawyers. And many here claim the roundup is indiscriminate.
When the state of emergency was enacted in March 2022 until now, the government has arrested over 70,000 people, which, if I'm not mistaken, is over 1% of the country's entire population. Many of those people are gang members. Many of those people are not gang members. But the scale of the arrests and the speed of the arrests have succeeded in basically sweeping up a big enough chunk of the gangs off the streets so that they don't have enough people to manage their day-to-day activities, which are mainly extortion and drug peddling on the streets. And there's not enough people to maintain control of the territories that they had basically dominated for several decades. And that has been the difference, really, that the speed and the scale of what this government has achieved, although albeit controversially, has rattled the gangs, has neutralized them, at least for now.
The mass arrests were just the first phase of President Bukele's plan. The second was unveiling to the world mega prisons meant to house those swept up in the crackdown. These giant concrete facilities look nothing like the jails and prisons of California and Central America, where MS-13 gang members could rub shoulders with underworld bosses and collaborate on operations. Instead, in these mega prisons, every aspect of life is closely controlled and monitored. The government invited journalists from around the world to visit the facilities, and they released shocking footage to show just how abrasive the conditions were. Dozens of gang members live together in single cells, the lights never go off, and temperatures regularly reach the 90s. They sleep on bare metal bunks with no sheets or mattresses. There are no visitors, and prisoners are never allowed outside.
So we spoke as part of we did an investigation into the state of emergency and the state of the gangs late last year. During that investigation, we spoke to several people who had been through the prison system and had come out the other side. None of them had actually faced criminal charges. They'd just been swept up in the arrest. And their accounts were pretty harrowing. It sounds like it is pretty grim behind bars. There is variation between the prisons in terms of modernity and the facilities. But we're hearing a lot of reports of over 100 people being held in a single cell. Those people all sharing one toilet, sharing recipient of water, which is next to the toilet, being fed almost no food on a daily basis. We're talking about maybe some tortilla, some beans, and some rice. It sounds they're very challenging conditions. There have also been reports of state abuses behind bars. You have a lot of civil society organizations which have been tracking the crackdown. They have interviewed far more people than we did. They have heard accounts of psychological torment behind bars from prison guards, reports of torture. If I'm not mistaken, the civil society organizations have also recorded around 100 deaths behind bars during the state of emergency, but it's sometimes quite hard to gauge what exactly is going on because the government is also very secretive, and typically the only access that is given to journalists to go inside the prisons to report would be in the newest, most modern prisons where the conditions are markedly better. But we also heard stories of people who were still recovering from fungal infections they got while behind bars. because they've been crammed in with so many people for such a long amount of time. And so, yeah, it's a very difficult situation. And as you say, the question is also how many of these people are actually linked to the gangs and how many of the people were just swept up by association.
Though the crackdown has had critics across the international community, it has had a dramatic effect on crime in El Salvador. With the rates of violence plummeting, and among the people of El Salvador, President Bukele has become a popular figure with rising approval ratings.
And we can talk about, this sort of constitutional rights violations and human rights violations that the government is using in order to, implement this crackdown. But just leaving that aside for a second and thinking about the impact that it's had on the gangs themselves, it's just been incredible. I mean, it's almost as if they dissolved, and we just didn't expect it. You have a criminal organization, 25 years in the making, definitely some structure, definitely some hierarchy, definitely some discipline. And, you've had many previous crackdowns as well, some of them involving also mass incarceration, but we've just never seen anything like this. Now, we have certain theories around why this has happened, and this is really the part about kind of human rights violations and other sort of constitutional liberties being completely and utterly suspended, including due process. And in essence, it has to do with, and you'll know this, being a sort of law enforcement person, they have loads of lists of potential or suspected gang members, and these lists are they're based on raw intelligence. They're not based on law enforcement investigations. They're based on raw intelligence, and they've had these lists for a very long time. And instead of sort of waiting for law enforcement to sort of come up with a case against these people who are on these lists of raw intelligence, they just decided they're going to arrest all of them, whether they had any evidence or not. And that's in essence what they did. And that's why you have, close to 80,000 people who were incarcerated, really within the first 4 months of the crackdown.
In terms of whether or not this same strategy could be implemented in other parts of Central America where crime and violence are prevalent, analysts like Steve Dudley remain skeptical.
This is a small country. I mean, this is a country the size of Massachusetts. So you're not talking about, you get a lot of talk now in the region about how Ecuador should implement, the Bukele is the name of the president of El Salvador, the Nayib Bukele plan. How are you going to do that? I mean, Ecuador is 20 times the size of El Salvador. I mean, it's just not, and it's not, they're not even facing down the same issues. So it's just one of these things that gets sort of bandied about, that this is sort of an easy thing. It's a model to move on. It's not. I mean, it's not even clear that this is going to be successful in the long term. And it's not even clear that this is necessarily the sort of end game. There's a lot of worry that basically they are, moving the gangs out of the way in order to replace it with some other type of organized crime that maybe is run from the kind of top down, the type of system we see in Nicaragua or Venezuela, which is a much more sort of a state-run mafia type organizations. And that's very troubling as well. That would, in some ways, be worse than the gangs. I don't want to say it would be worse because, I don't want to sort of belittle the suffering that gangs can produce, but nonetheless, you replace one with the other. Where are we?
My name is Vince Vargas. Thank you for watching Reasonable Fear, a Borderlands special series, an Ironclad original. Be sure to check out @This is Ironclad on YouTube for more from this series, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.